I'm going to talk about what we've learned from the science, not just my research, but research that I've done with my collaborators, who I'll acknowledge at the end. And also what's different about the work I do is that I have a very close working relationship with practitioners, and also I work very closely with developments in policy and practice. And so I'm constantly looking at what's happening within the criminal justice system, as we call it in Britain, and looking at developments across Europe, and when I was in the US, of course, North America as well, and looking at how my research can be shaped by these developments and learning from practice, not just learning from the lab and from my reading of the literature. And I guess that's kind of one of the unique things about the way I work. So this is an overview of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to start with the birth of the cognitive interview. And I was actually there for its birth. It was my first postdoc position at UCLA with Ed Geiselman, and Ron Fisher worked with him too. I'm going to talk about how the cognitive interview, which is really an investigative approach that's really compatible with best practice interviews, how it's practiced today and some of the key phases and tools. And they have been influenced not just by research, but practice. Some of the more recent modifications of this interview that enable us to get to eyewitnesses very quickly and in a very efficient manner. So the paper and pencil version of the cognitive interview, which is known as the SAI. I'm going to talk about, I wanted to mention some of the influence that Jim Bartlett had. So I'm going to talk briefly about a study that we did looking at whether we could train seniors in the use of the cognitive interview and give them some transferable skills. I'm then going to sort of have a break halfway through my talk and present the video for which I got the prize that Mario mentioned at the beginning of 2017 prize. As a result of that, it sums up some of the work I've been doing from the mid-90s into the early 2000s, working especially with vulnerable witnesses. And that work illustrates the close relationship I've had with the police. And in fact, that video was made shortly after some of you may have heard, we had a terrible bombing a couple of years ago in Manchester at a concert. And the police officers working on there were the same ones that I worked with, and they used the cognitive interview to question some of the witnesses. So I'm going to sort of have a break from talking just for a few minutes while you watch the video. And then I'll shift to looking at what's happened more recently, really from 2010 onwards, where some of the techniques that were developed for witnesses have been applied to questioning suspects, including the work of the HIG group, which I'll introduce. And then more recently in Europe, the development of the non-coercive interviewing protocol, which was a result of the anti-torture initiative. And again, we're going to see sort of methods that were developed similar to the cognitive interview and being put into practice. And then I'll end with some of the current work I'm doing at the Center for the Study of Emotion and Law, which is looking at how best to question and interview asylum seekers, where many of their claims are denied on the basis that they don't appear credible. And this is a very big project, but I'll present results from one study that we did looking at young asylum seekers and end with what I'm sort of looking at now. So I thought I'd just start with what the investigative interview is. So all the interview protocols I'm going to talk about today are evidence-based, and they've developed over a number of years. Some of them were really a response to miscarriages of justice that came from inappropriate ways of questioning suspects. And I don't have time to talk about those miscarriages of justice. So I just wanted to start with saying that the interview procedure I talk about is science-based, but also practitioner-based. So if you are looking to identify whose footprints those are in the snow picture, what you would need to do to get a really detailed information, whether it's from a witness, it's from multiple witnesses, is to be able to very much pay attention to the witness, to listen carefully, to ask questions in detail in a systematic manner, to search for whatever the source is for that trace or footprint, whether it's animal, human. And the term investigative comes from the Latin investigar, vestigium. So that's where the term comes from. but the element of any good witness or suspect interview should be this investigative approach. So I thought I'd give you that at the beginning, and now I'm going to sort of start by telling you about the work, my work. So I started off between 1985 and 1987. This was the birth of the cognitive interview, and I'll tell you what the cognitive interview is in a moment. But round about 1985, Fisher and Geiselman were approached by the police and asked if they could come up with a way, an effective way for questioning cooperative eyewitnesses. And so the first graph here shows you one of the earliest studies that was done by Geiselman and colleagues, where they simply compared an interview technique, the cognitive interview, with the way in which police officers typically interview witnesses, which was the standard interview. And the standard interview was just firing off a series of questions, constantly interrupting the witness, not really following the investigative approach at all. So Geiselman and Fisher did a couple of studies in the lab like this, where they showed that when you questioned, most of the early studies were with college students, when you question eyewitnesses that have seen a mock crime or a video with the cognitive interview as compared to a standard, lo and behold, the cognitive interview across numerous studies could yield as much as 35–40% more information. And then later on, and I was involved in this research and listening to some of the interviews, what they did is they took a bunch of officers from the Metro-Dade Police Department in Florida, the robbery division, who are frequently used to questioning witnesses, and they split them into two groups. One group weren't trained at all. This was the control group. A second group got training in the cognitive interview, and they followed them over a 3-month period. So the comparison was between the trained and untrained cognitive, so between those that received training over the 3 months and the control group over the same period of time that didn't receive training. And they were compared before training and after training. And as you can see, training, a sample of police officers in the cognitive interview resulted in significant gains. And this is from real eyewitnesses, where the correct information was corroborating details. So this was, it continues to, it is still one of the, just one of two field studies that have been conducted, but we have many anecdotal examples of how the cognitive interview is used today, and it's certainly part of training, which I'll talk about later within the UK. So these were some of the early lab and field studies. So what is the cognitive interview? Well, the 1985 study drew on some basic memory theory, which I'll go over quite quickly. But this was essentially, and I'm not going to, because I know Steve Smith's in the audience, so I'm not going to go on into too much detail about physical or mental reinstatement of context, but I have got an example where I do it, so I'll show you that on video. But these were the 4 techniques to get the witness to mentally or physically take themselves back to the original encoding context, to report everything, partial, incomplete information, all details, to recall in reverse order, to recall from different perspectives. So multiple retrieval attempts. And some of the obvious theoretical backdrop to reinstating context is encoding specificity theory. And I think most of you here will be familiar with the classic, I still love to tell my students about Alan Baddeley's study, and it was a very nice demonstration of context-dependent memory. So in addition to encoding specificity theory, Fisher and Geiselman drew on Anderson's work that the level of activation, strength of memory for any particular item of information in the network will determine the probability and speed of it being recalled and the amount of activation it can emit. Obviously, this depends on the quality of the original encoding and retention interval factors that I'll refer to. And they also drew upon Bauer's multi-component view of memory trace, so that there are several memory paths to memory for an event. Information not accessible with one route might be accessible with another. So in 2010, Chris Mesner and I did a meta-analysis and a study space analysis. Study space identifies gaps in our knowledge we wanted to see what's been looked at over the last, over the last 20 or so years. And we included published studies only of the cognitive interview. And the cognitive interview has been modified, and I'll talk about how it was modified and developed in a moment. But let me just give you the data that supports the use of the technique. So we looked at a large number of studies, mostly with college students, but some of them had used other populations. I replicated the cognitive interview effect with a sample of Brazilians from a different demographic as part of a collaborative project. Most of these studies had different control groups. So one of the things that I did when I started working on the cognitive interview is I argued, and I remember having this discussion with Ron Fisher, that if you wanted to compare the cognitive interview with anything, it shouldn't be with a standard police interview. It should be with an interview that's matched in terms of quality of rapport building, in terms of the structure, and the only thing that should differ is the cognitive techniques, because otherwise you can't claim that it's the cognitive techniques that are effective. It may be that the standard of an interview is ineffective because there's frequent interruptions to the witness. So many of the later studies started comparing the cognitive interview, or CI, with a structured interview, and I'll explain to you what a structured interview is in a moment. There have been two meta-analyses. We did one in 1999 as well, so 10 years earlier. Both meta-analyses showed similar large effects of cognitive interview on correct details. And in both meta-analyses, we do find a small increase in incorrect details. And if people want to ask me questions about this and what underlies that, I mean, I'm happy. I could spend a whole hour talking about why I think there might be cognitive interview techniques might elicit an increase in a few incorrect details, and why this isn't an issue, because overall accuracy rates are unaffected. Obviously, in the meta-analysis, and as you will be familiar with research, how well a witness remembers will depend on their strength of the original encoding, the encoding conditions, the nature of the to be remembered event, retention interval, and of course, leading and misleading questions. And this is one of the first things that I looked at in my own research. And I was really interested in whether, well, if you interview someone with a cognitive interview, what if you haven't got to them before they've already been questioned by someone else who's introduced misleading questions? So can the cognitive interview protect you from subsequent misleading questioning? Or if you've already been misled, can you still get the original memory? And this was quite an interesting question that I addressed with Maria Zaragoza in a paper that we called Inoculation or Antidote: The Effects of Cognitive Interview Timing on False Memories for Forcibly Fabricated Events. And we used a procedure developed by Maria where she forces eyewitnesses to fabricate events by questioning them in a highly leading manner. And so we asked this question: can the negative effects of forced confabulation be undone? And we found that the cognitive interview did actually reduce the likelihood of false memories for participants that had been forced to fabricate an event a week earlier, but only if they had initially been questioned with a cognitive interview before they were subject to these highly misleading questions. So this, together with some other evidence, makes it clear that if we're going to question eyewitnesses with a procedure like the cognitive interview that seems to aid recall, then we need to question them as early as possible and before they're subject to misleading or leading questions. So now I'm going to talk about how the original procedure has developed and changed. And sort of, it was in 1990 that I got my first grant. And my son here, who's now 31, was at school, and he got pulled into the lab by my two research assistants here. And this was the first study that we published in '92 on the cognitive interview. And it became very apparent, and the Fisher and Geiselman book is still a great text that sums up why you can't think of the cognitive interview as 4 cognitive techniques. You can't conduct an interview and say, right, I'm gonna just apply these techniques, these 4 techniques and see if I get an increase in correct recall. That's just not the way you can conduct an interview. An interview, a skilled interview, involves an interviewer managing the communication and establishing trust and rapport with the witness. And so very early on, when I started doing my lab studies with kids, I realized that what was going to be the first thing I needed to train my research assistants, interviewers in, is how to effectively communicate with the witness. And that the use of the cognitive techniques was intimately connected with the mode of communication and the manner in which you established a relationship with the witness. And context reinstatement wasn't going to be effective if the witness didn't feel in control of the interview, if you didn't use open questions, if you didn't listen attentively. And I tried really hard to do studies where I looked at one of the cognitive techniques in isolation and compared it to the other, and it just didn't work, especially when I was working with kids. So I realized that an effective eyewitness interview isn't just cognitive techniques, it encompasses two core principles, which have become the principles of investigative interviewing today, which is communication and memory. And so it's actually really hard to test, to answer the question, what is it about the cognitive interview that makes it an effective interviewing protocol? It really does involve both these things. So this is how the cognitive interview is applied today. It's seen as a phased approach, and it's an approach where you start with by personalizing the interview and asking very open-ended questions to establish trust with the witness, so that they feel comfortable doing most of the talking in an interview. And when I was working in 1987, looking at the typical police interview with the Metro-Dade police, I realized that's not how they were conducting their questioning. A lot of the questioning was very closed and just based on a fixed protocol that the interviewer had, and a lot of the questions required yes/no answers, which closed the search process for the witness. So once you've established rapport, you then you apply the first cognitive technique. And I didn't realize, again, until I started doing my research, that transfer of control is essentially a cognitive technique, because without giving the witness permission to do all the talking and to search their memory, then reinstating context and getting the witness to report in detail doesn't work. So you have to take my word for it. And the training is a 2-week training. I think when we train witnesses properly in the cognitive interview in the lab, I can sometimes do it over a couple of days, but the interviewers really need to understand that each phase is connected. And mostly what you do in the cognitive interview is, once you've spent a good length of time establishing rapport, and even maybe doing a practice interview if it's with a child witness, and explaining the aims and the ground rules, which is, if something's not clear, you can say, ask me to repeat it. If you don't know the answer, it's okay to say, I don't know, and explain to them that they are going to do the talking. You then apply the 2 techniques that the research literature has found to be the most effective, and that is report in detail and reinstate context. And only then do you ask questions. So there's no questioning, only an open-ended question up until phase 3. In phase 4, a good cognitive interviewer will base their questioning only on what the witness has told you in phase 3. And then the last part of the cognitive interview, which we now realize, having questioned people who are highly traumatized, and including in some terror investigations and in intelligence gathering, is closure has become a key part of the interview. Because if a witness is too distressed to complete the interview and talk to you, or if they're withholding things because they don't trust you or they're afraid, then if you end with a good closure, you have the potential to extend the life of the interview, and also to make sure they leave the interview room feeling less negative and more positive, and at least calm if it's a distressing event. So closure has become quite an important, still under research, part of the interview. And I've got a funnel there. I don't know what you guys might call a funnel, but the idea is that you really start with a very open-ended approach to questioning, and only later on would you narrow down and ask a specific question that you had, because specific questions, we know from research, are more likely to yield inaccurate answers. And also, if somebody's going to start asking leading questions, then they're not familiar with how to avoid leading and misleading questions, a witness might be more likely to be misled. So we don't advocate anything other than asking open-ended questions in a cognitive interview. So just to explain a little bit more detail, research has been done on some of these components. There's a lot of research that's been done in the last few years looking at the effectiveness of rapport building. There's many different ways in which you can establish rapport with the witness, but effectively, the idea is to make the witness realize that they are the important person in the interview, let them do the talking, let them dictate the pace, ask witness compatible questions, which is something that Fisher and Geiserman also highlight. It helps the interviewee understand what their role is. It encourages witnesses to talk more, and it also reduces the likelihood of confirmation bias and hypothesis-led questioning. So the cognitive interview would say the interviewer shouldn't be testing any hypothesis at all, but allowing the witness to give their account first. And later on, you'll see how this, which is a witness interviewing protocol, is now being applied to questioning suspects. So here I did this very last minute interview with my research assistant who had witnessed an accident on her way to work. It's not my best interview, but I feel like I should give you an example. So bear in mind, it's not my best interview. I do repeat myself a bit, but I'm gonna play this now for you.
So what I'd like you to do now is, before you give me an account of what you witnessed yesterday on Egham Hill, I'd like you to take yourself back to that day. I understand that you were on your way to work that morning. So I'd like you to mentally take yourself back to that morning on Egham Hill. Sometimes people find it helps if they close their eyes. It's entirely up to you. And I want you to recall how you were feeling that morning as you were walking into university. Think about your surroundings, what you could see and what you could hear immediately preceding the event. And just take yourself time to put yourself back to that moment as you were walking up the hill towards the university campus. Think about what you could hear, what if anything you could see at the time, and then I want you to start from the moment you realise something had happened, and describe to me in as much detail as you can from the beginning what you witnessed.
Okay, so actually I was on a bike going up the hill, and it's quite steep, so I had to pressure myself a little bit to go further up, but I just realized that something was wrong on the other side of the road, so I was going up and a lady was coming down, but she already made like weird movements with her car, like, you know, a little bit curvy, and then I looked to the driver's seat and I saw that she was completely crumbled. So she had like her shoulders up, her hand up like that, and had like her head was very in an unnatural position and her face was very tight, so it really looked like she was out of control and shaking. And I also saw two dogs behind her, quite big dogs, like kind of bulldog dogs, I think. And so I think she was carrying them and they came closer to her, maybe because they also felt that something was wrong. So she came down and I already saw that, and I immediately stopped. And then I saw from above, because she was going down further, that she even lost more control over the car and it went to the other side of the road, and there was a small silver car coming up, And oh yeah, there were many cars behind beeping to make the others aware what is happening, because yeah, but I think there was not much option for the others to leave. So the car crossed over to the other side of the road and hit the car frontally, so it was a frontal collision, which was very strong. So I saw how the cars met each other, and then like both of them were thrown back again. And the smaller car had such a, well, the silver car that was choken was smaller than the one from the lady going down. The one from the lady was like a van, not a true van. I'm not so good in cars. Like a combi. Yeah, so it was not super big, but way bigger than the smaller other car coming up. So the smaller car was backwards and crashed into like a lightning. So it was smashed from both sides, and the car coming down then slightly due to the collision changed the path, but was still like struggling down, rushed into another car which was blue and more sporty like, and then again like krach, and then I guess due to the collision.
So what you can see there is Julia is giving me so much detail, and I know she was really traumatized by this because she called me at the time that it happened. But I actually, before I turned the video on, I kind of got her to sit down and we had a chat, and I made sure she was calm. We had some tea and then we started. I was quite like worried about her when I was talking, but you can see the detail with which she's describing what took place, and she was actually the key witness. And you can see that I'm not interrupting her, I'm listening, I'm not actually commenting on what she's saying. If I was an interviewer that was going to then follow that up with questioning, I might take some notes, but they would be very short notes because I would still want to be showing that I'm engaging in active listening. And this is what I meant when I talked about the cognitive interview being not just a set of techniques, but actually the whole environment in which you conduct the interview. And that's why this transfer of control, which I can't actually give you an operational definition, clear operational definition of, is so key in interviewing. So that was just to illustrate the use of the rapport and transfer of control and context reinstatement instruction. There have been a number of case studies, and one of the earliest case studies where the cognitive interview was used was when a realtor was kidnapped. So a man had come into a realtor's office and Stephanie Slater had shown him around a house. He then kidnapped her, and the police received a ransom call from the kidnapper, and in the call they could hear some sounds which they weren't sure what they were. They could hear a bell. And they went back to the office where the realtor worked and questioned the witnesses who'd seen the man that day. And the witnesses weren't able to yield anything. And they then used a cognitive interview on the witnesses. And they found the report everything technique yielded something very critical. One of the witnesses remembered that the man that had come in that day was wearing a small badge on his jacket, and this is a train spotter badge, and this badge indicates that this person is a fan of railways and observing trains, a train spotter. And actually, when this small piece of information was subsequently paired with information that Stephanie gave after she was released, eventually the police were able to locate her and release her, and she had been tied up and held by a disused railway, where there was a shop where she heard a bell ringing regularly. And the police then realized that the train spotting badge connected with the tape, because on the tape in the background, they realized the noise they could hear was that of trains. So that's two small pieces of information. When she was questioned, because the police still hadn't found the kidnapper, they were able to get very detailed information about Stephanie, who had been tied, she could remember using the context reinstatement, things like the smell on the kidnapper's clothes. She remembered the feeling of walking on cobblestones, and she remembered the thick rope that he had used. And all this information together really played a vital role. So, you know, there is evidence from that the cognitive interview can be effectively used. And in the video I'll show you later, you'll see that the police are very favourable towards using this approach, even though it means it's quite a lengthy interview. And because it's a lengthy interview, one of the things that we know from memory is that if we don't question witnesses promptly, then they're more likely to be subject to discussing their memories with others, or of course they'll start to forget details over time. This is why I questioned Julia the day that she witnessed the accident. We also know that it's not always possible to have police officers trained in the cognitive interview that can be present to administer the interview. So two of my former graduate students, who are both professors now, Lorraine Hope and Fiona Gabbett, developed the self-administered interview, and they actually received support from the police to field test this. So this is a paper and pencil version of the cognitive interview, and together with Ron Fisher, they compared this interview to the full face-to-face cognitive interview and found it was just as effective. So the self-administered interview is widely used today. It's very useful for what we in the UK call frontline investigators. So these might be paramedics, police officers, traffic accident officers. These are the police officers that will be first at the scene of the crime. These may not be the senior detectives that are trained in the cognitive interview. So the idea was to have something that these officers can give to witnesses straight away so they can get a detailed account from them. The benefits, obviously, it's time and resource efficient. It reduces also the demand characteristics. Now, stereotype threat is a particular concern that maybe older adult witnesses have, that perhaps they're not going to be good witnesses and they don't think they're going to provide helpful information because they're an older adult. But by giving them something that they can complete in their own time, you don't have to worry about, you know, conveying any information about the witness lacking confidence. It can be used also in multiple contexts, and it's been recently used to help find missing persons. So that's the latest paper that Fiona Gabbett published. And as I said earlier, it's comparable to a face-to-face interview as in the studies documented here. And this is an example of the self-administered interview. So it takes the witness through the cognitive interview. They can take their own time. They can do it on an iPad or something similar, and they can provide detailed descriptions. And you can see why this might be really useful for tracing missing persons as well. So it is currently in use in the UK and is a useful procedure. And where it's been published, so we have the College of Policing in the UK, and they've actually presented this as a tool for their first responders, the people that are at the scene of the crime first. And this is a quote from the guidance, which is for police officers: eliciting an initial account is vital to prevent further harm, loss, but also to reduce cognitive social influences on memory. So this is a policy police training document that is saying, you know, here's a tool that prevents cognitive and social influences on memory. And that's quite a significant development if you think about the science influencing practice. So I was really pleased to see that Hope and Gabbett's research was now being cited and applied in this way. And this was just two or three years after they'd finished doing it. So the science was rapidly being turned into practice. So we've done some work. I've done some work on the self-administered interview. I've looked at its potential with vulnerable witnesses, and in particular, one of the first studies I did, and this is where I was inspired by, I think one of the best things that Jim and I wrote together was a chapter that came out in the handbook, the Eyewitness Memory Handbook the Handbook of Eyewitness Psychology, which was in 2 volumes that Rod Lindsay, David Frost, Don Reed and Mike Toglier edited, which is a great handbook actually for students who haven't looked at it. It's not out of date, it's got great chapters. Anyway, Jim did most of the work on this chapter, of course. And in this chapter, Jim drew upon much of his work and work that really influenced me, which showed that, you know, one of the things that happens with aging, and we were especially interested in how older adults, seniors, perform on executive tasks such as that require them to accurately remember source information. And if you think about an eyewitness, one of the most important things that they need to be able to do is accurately recollect the context in which the incident took place. And, you know, you saw me doing that when I was questioning Julia about the traffic accident. And one of the hypotheses that we tested in a couple of our studies is that perhaps older adults might have more difficulty accurately recollecting context. And we tested that in many of our studies to do with eyewitness identification that I'm not going to talk about today. But based on that, I really wanted to see whether the cognitive interview could be a potentially useful tool for witnesses that are quite fearful of crime, and seniors are, and also a lot of our seniors are more likely to witness crimes such as robbery, and the police had expressed an interest in us doing something. So we asked a really interesting question in our study, which is that if we could train our older adults using the self-administered interview to complete the self-administered interview when they witnessed one crime, and then a week later, we got those witnesses to witness a second crime, and this is all, these are all videotapes of crimes, then would they spontaneously use the techniques that they had used before when they completed the self-administered interviews? So could we get them, train them into becoming witnesses who could, you know, just spontaneously, whenever they witness a crime, recollect the context, report in detail, and so on. So we had quite a complex design here where we had just seniors, aged between 60 and 80 years, average age 70. These were healthy, active members of the community. We didn't give them any tests in this study to look at any deficits in executive functioning or working memory. And we had them witness 2 events separated by a week. And they were then interviewed with the self-administered interview or a control procedure, which we called free recall, where we had rapport building, transfer of control. They gave an account, but we didn't use any cognitive techniques. And we had 2 videos that we had created in our lab already. One is a date rape scenario. I know it's not as applicable to older adults, but we nevertheless had this scenario. We wanted 2 different scenarios. The other scenario was where is a scam scenario where an elderly resident has a knock on the door. Somebody has come to test the fireplace to see if it's working properly. The older adult goes to make a cup of tea and then they're robbed. And so we had witnesses come to the lab and they either saw event 1 or event 2. And when they saw event 1, they were either interviewed with the self-administered interview or a control procedure. A week later, they came back to view a second event, and this time everybody was interviewed with the free recall control procedure. And we created a delay by giving people filler tasks. Now, our hypothesis was, our question of interest was, first of all, would those seniors who were tested with a self-administered interview recall more correct details about the event than those tested with the free recall control? And secondly, would the group that had received the self-administered interview then spontaneously use it when they were questioned a week later about the second event using the free recall? And first of all, we got what we call the SAI effect. In terms of number of correct details, our seniors tested with a self-administered interview produced more correct details. For both scenarios, actually, they were accurate whether it was the date rape or the scam scenario. There was no difference in accuracy rates, and that's typical when it comes to self-administered and cognitive interview. But we also got what we call the SAI effect, and we're still not sure. Those who had been questioned, had used the self-administered interview, we call them the SAA experience, recalled more correct details than those who were initially questioned with a free recall and never had a chance to complete a a cognitive interview or a self-administered interview. So we haven't followed this up, but I thought it would be a nice study to talk about, and I'd be really interested in kind of having a discussion about this and thinking about, well, what was going on here. So I'm going to sort of break now to talk a little bit about, as I was going to talk about some of the work I've done with kids with autism spectrum disorder, and then I thought, no, what I'll do is I'll show you instead, as this talk is about science and practice coming together, a very short video that we made with the police to kind of sum up why it's important not just to work in the lab, but how we've worked together with the police. So I'm going to show you this video now that was created. Before I do that, I should say that about the time that I was doing the work and I started moving from college, I moved from working with college students as witnesses to children with special needs, to seniors. There was a lot of things going on in the legal system. So in the UK, we had something called Achieving Best Evidence, which was guidance that was being developed for anybody that conducts interviews with victims and witnesses. There were also opportunities for children to give their testimony outside of the courtroom. And there was a great deal of interest in having psychologists contribute to these. So I didn't contribute to this one, but I contributed to the equivalent one in Scotland. And some of the work that's talked about in the video that you're going to see in a moment was work that I did when I was in Scotland just before I came to Royal Holloway. It was funded as a result of my getting funding from the Economic and Social Research Council, who have funded a lot of my work on the cognitive interview, and also a result of my collaboration with one particular police force, the Greater Manchester Police, who've taken a real leading role in questioning witnesses and using the science. So here's the video.
In the late 80s, there was little understanding of the process of gathering information from eyewitnesses. The emphasis was on how to get confessions and prosecute guilty suspects. I was one of the leading figures to change the way police officers approached witness interviews using evidence-based techniques for questioning. My name is Amina Memon. I am Professor of Psychology at Royal Holloway, University of London. I lead the Royal Holloway Eyewitness Research Group, which explores the role of eyewitness evidence and decision-making within the criminal justice system. My research on the cognitive interview examined how to collect information from children at a time where there were real concerns about the competence and credibility of child witnesses. Concerns arose from high-profile cases where investigations of alleged child abuse failed to result in prosecutions, often because of faulty investigative practices and poor interviewing techniques. My ESRC-funded research in the 1990s set about showing how child witnesses could provide accurate and detailed information when questioned appropriately. I was able to directly apply my research when tasked with writing the Scottish Best Practice Guidance. Asked you to take part in a video identification parade. Is that okay? The new approach to interviews increased the potential value of evidence, not just from witnesses but also from victims, and especially in cases where eyewitness testimony provided crucial evidence. What was unique about my work was that I didn't adopt a one-size-fits-all approach. I took a procedure for gathering detailed eyewitness reports and adapted it for use within a structure that would help police officers communicate with the witness. For example, I looked at how officers engaged with witnesses in the opening of the interview, how they established a rapport so that witnesses felt comfortable enough to share information with them. I showed that it was only through creating this environment of trust and focusing attention on the witness that the so-called cognitive techniques could be put into practice and elicit detailed testimonies. I first heard about the work of Greater Manchester Police as a force that was open to learning from academics about the latest science on interviewing witnesses. I was introduced to senior officers who were at the time working on new cases stemming from the Rochdale investigation of abuse of underage girls. I learnt that they were not only familiar with the cognitive interview, but they themselves had been contributing to research and training, and they were putting my research into practice in their ongoing detective work with vulnerable witnesses.
I didn't get too good a glimpse because the person then ran off that way.
Okay. When I think what we have now by way of a toolkit to what we had when I started as a police officer, there's no comparison. It centres around memory, how witnesses function, how we can seek to try and decontaminate somebody's recollection of events is very, very useful. But more importantly, in our line of work, it's got to be ethical and proper. By going about our business in an ethical and professional way, we know that what we're securing from our witnesses, our victims, and on occasions our suspects, where you might use similar cognitive techniques with them on occasions, we know that we will stand scrutiny.
Standardised and evidence-based interview practice means that the police are less likely to see their evidence challenged in court. Judges and juries are better able to reach the correct verdict as a result of more reliable evidence, and suspects are less likely to be wrongly accused. Overall, it means we can have greater confidence in the fairness and effectiveness of criminal justice.
So that was just a summary of how we developed the work. That police force in particular, as they mentioned in the video, had some real issues with vulnerable witnesses. It was one of the biggest child abuse inquiries at the time. And so they were clearly interested in a tool that they could use. And as a result of that work that we did with them, many other projects became possible for us and also for them. And so we continue to have a really good working relationship, working in a highly sensitive area. And as the police officer mentioned there, you know, it's also important for them because the cognitive interview enables them to have a professional, ethical way of gathering information. And that's especially important, I'd say, not just for questioning witnesses and victims of crime, but also when it comes to interviewing suspects. So kind of 10 years into my research, from the early 2000s, it became apparent that some of the cognitive techniques could be applied to questioning suspects. And at the time, there wasn't much work going on looking at the potential of the cognitive interview, but there was an opportunity that was provided for there to be substantial work looking at how the cognitive interview could be applied. And that resulted from the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group that was funded in 2009. Sorry, that's from telling me that I've almost run out of time, so I'm going to go through this bit quite quickly to identify best practices for questioning terrorists. And this work has yielded a lot of information about how best to question and engage in rapport with suspects. And some of the findings have really mirrored what we found in the lab with cognitive interviews. So I'll skip through this bit, but really important work as a result of the HIG group. Cognitive interviews now being taught in federal interrogation training academies. The Air Force's special investigators are now using the active listening skills, the rapport building, the transfer of control that I talked about earlier, and finding that this is really important for gathering intelligence information, and that a cooperative approach can result in investigative information gain. So what we're now seeing is an investigative approach being applied to questioning suspects. And this is an approach that was used to question the Norwegian terrorists here, Anders Breivik, who murdered a large number of people, absolutely horrific. And here the officer, Asbjørn Raklu, used the cognitive interview and says it's really important not just to question him as a suspect, but and he murdered many high school kids in a terrorist incident, but the parents will want to know the details of what he did, and it's really important to conduct a detailed investigation. And what's happening now is, as a result of the work of the Anti-Torture Initiative within Europe, there's a process to develop an investigative interviewing model and have legal safeguards to accompany it. And this is based on a large body of evidence that shows that torture and ill treatment and coercion are not just ineffective, but they're actually counterproductive and can increase miscarriages of justice. So at the moment, I've seen it, but I wasn't sure if it was appropriate to share it just yet. So experts from psychology, law, human rights, policing are applying their research, and they're developing a protocol so that a systematic approach that avoids bias can be used to question suspects, upholding the presumption of innocence. Many of the techniques are very similar to the investigative approach, the techniques that I've talked about, and have been built into the protocol. And in terms of future directions, there are many challenges that we've had. So in the London Bridge attack, the cognitive interview was used. Breivik, this is the attack that Breivik was responsible for. The cognitive interview was used there to elicit information about his mental state, as well as the impact on victims. These kinds of situations cause a great deal of trauma. And so there's also the issue about how to support police officers when they're questioning witnesses who have trauma. And many of these were the Norwegian police officers that report that, rapport is not just a tick box, but it's an active process. And they're citing Fisher and Geiselman about how important rapport building is when questioning people after a very traumatic incident. At the moment, within the UK, we're developing a procedure called Whiskey. It's actually a way of questioning witnesses in high-profile incidents involving multiple witnesses. And they're using something called a structured interview or the self-administered interview. But part of that is, first of all, to just check, is the witness fit enough to be questioned, or should we wait? And it's really important to see that the practitioners, the police officers, are understanding that a traumatized witness may not be a very helpful witness. And there's a lot more research that needs to be done here. Obviously, it's very hard for us to simulate the kind of trauma that we see in these incidents in the lab. So we're still not sure how effective the cognitive interview is, but anecdotal evidence suggests it can be really helpful. Of course, another goal of interviewing can be to assess credibility, and that may be more likely in suspects interviews. And we know that information gathering approaches like the investigative interview are more diagnostic as compared to confession-led approaches. And that's really important because there are very few non-verbal cues. And we're questioning suspects often in very diverse cultural contexts. And this leads me to the last point, really, is when we're questioning witnesses with whom from backgrounds that we're unfamiliar with, and the very traumatic situations, for example, in asylum interviews where the decision and that person's story being believed is absolutely crucial for them. They may be highly traumatized, they may be a victim of torture, and trauma is likely to affect memory quality and increase vulnerability. And this is the work that I'm doing right now. We've just finished a paper together with Gisli Good-Johnson. Some of you may know of his work that he's developed a scale to assess suggestibility. And we managed to get a very unique sample of young separated youth who had experienced numerous negative life events. And we wanted to see whether this population was more suggestible in an interview. And here they're not just being questioned as witnesses, but often with a bias or a mindset that they could be lying. So the interviewers may not just be assessing information, gathering information, but assessing credibility. And one of the things that we found, this is just data that we've just finished collecting, is that our separated youth, when compared to a group of young people who have come from disadvantaged backgrounds, score much higher on suggestibility. They're much more likely to change their answers in the face of negative feedback from the interviewer. And also, this is an average, so I don't know if you can see this here, but these individuals have experienced something like an average of 45 negative life events as compared to 16. And when you look at this population and you look at interviewing this population, you compare it with the published literature. And here are just some of the things that these young people have witnessed and experienced. You realize that you've got a very highly traumatized, vulnerable population. And we're only just beginning to understand how we should be questioning these populations effectively so that they can be subject to fair and effective process, where if they are needing asylum, they're granted it. But unfortunately, that isn't happening, because we're still seeing, and this is the latest report on asylum interviews conducted by our Home Office, and they've just announced that they are now moving to remote interviewing. Not only that, then they are going to be outsourcing the interviews, and we don't know who will be conducting these interviews. But some of the things they find as asylum seekers that have been traumatized from torture and sexual violence are not even being allowed to give a full account of their experiences. They're not being subject to a positive and secure environment. Poor questioning techniques are being used. And one of the problems with remote interviewing is we don't think that the remote interviews are going to provide a good environment for assessing risk and identifying vulnerability. And so far, the qualitative data suggests that people have left the interview feeling dehumanized, re-traumatized, and despairing whether they can get a fair decision. So it's very challenging times. And this morning I was at a museum where, together with artists, we're now looking at what's inevitably not just a dystopian future, but we've created this Orwellian experience. So we've created an artificial intelligence security guard that, I'll just show you, that simulates the experience of an avatar or an AI that questions people about their reasons for seeking asylum, but bases their judgment about whether the person is granted asylum or not based on their facial expressions. The facial expressions are monitored here. Small changes in micro expressions, and those of you that are familiar with the deception literature will know about the reliability or the unreliability of making decisions. So we've been doing this work simulating what it might be like and what may be happening as we rely on facial recognition technology, and the consequences for individuals seeking refuge and asylum if decisions are made based on a faulty understanding of deception detection and use of artificial intelligence. So we're hoping to collect data as a result of this exhibit very soon. Is the science ahead of practice? Well, I think it should be keeping up. We think there are many issues. These are just some issues that I grabbed from the newspapers this week, and I won't go into them, but there are lots of issues associated with the pandemic that are arising, I'm sure similarly in the US, we know. But one of the things that we do know is that it's really important where there is an investigation to have some kind of tool to get a good substantive account from the witness, and quickly. And we know that we have to have something that can help us with a traumatized, vulnerable interviewee. And here we're just conducting a systematic review at the moment to look at what some of the risks of remote interviewing are. And for very good reasons, we've had to move to remote interviewing. My work has been supported by many people, and you'll recognize one face here very well, but I won't name them all. Ray Ball was actually one of my undergraduate lecturers, Ron Fisher, Geisman, who I worked with. And I'm really pleased, Becky Milne, who does a lot of the training now, is a professor, and Fiona and Lorraine, who developed the self-administered interview, Chris and Lillian, who I collaborated with in Brazil on the cognitive interview, Alan, the late Alan Scoboria, who was a fantastic collaborator, and we did a lot of great work on meta memory together. And with Katie, we've been looking at use of cognitive interview for individuals with autism spectrum disorder. So there's some great work going on. 2 books have just come out that summarize for those students who are interested. So if you're interested in this field and you want, these aren't my books, I don't make any money from this, but they've been written by experts in the field. And a book that really sums up what I was talking about at the beginning, the link between communication and cognitive technique, is this Shepherd and Griffith's book on conversation management. So I would recommend that, because I think his